My name is Voss, and I am 31 years old. 3 months ago, I sat across a conference table from the man who raised me and watched him sign his name to a document that said I had never existed in his company. He did it in front of his lawyer, his second wife, and the 2 stepchildren. He had been quietly transferring my inheritance to for 11 years. What he did not know, because I had not told him, was that I had a copy of every transfer order, every amended filing, and every notarized signature going back to the year I turned 20. The folder was sitting in my car in the parking garage. 4 floors below us. I had driven it there from a storage unit in Sacramento the night before. I did not bring it upstairs. I did not need to yet. I just needed to watch him sign his name one more time so that the date on the document would match the date on the letter I had already mailed to the California Department of Business Oversight at 8 a.m. that morning. Welcome to the Long Count. This is the channel for people who kept records. When everyone told them, they were imagining things. If you have ever been the person in the room who knew the most and said the least, this story is for you. Drop a comment and subscribe. I will be here every week. Let me start with the object, because the object is the whole story. When I was 9 years old, my father gave me a ledger, not a toy, not a game, an actual green cloth covered accounting ledger. The kind with the red margin line printed down the left side of every page. He sat me down at the kitchen table in our house on Cabrillo Street in San Francisco. And he opened it to the first page, and he wrote the date at the top in his neat block print. He said, "Delia, every serious person keeps a record," he said. "A number you remember is a guess. A number you wrote down is a fact." He taught me to log my allowance, my savings, every dollar in and every dollar out. He made me reconcile the columns. Every Sunday, before dinner, I was 9. I thought it was a game. I did not know he was handing me the only weapon I would ever need against him. I still have that ledger. The green cloth cover is soft at the corners now. The first entry reads, October 14th, allowance received, $5. Balance, $5. My handwriting was enormous and uneven. I was 9. By the time I was 12, the columns were tight and clean. By the time I was 20, I had filled 4 more ledgers exactly like it. And by the time I sat across that conference table at 31, I had a storage unit in Sacramento with 11 years of documentation that would have made my father's own accountant go pale. That is the motif. The green ledger. Remember it. By the end of this story, it means something entirely different than it does right now. My name is Delia Voss. I am 31 years old. I grew up in San Francisco, the only child of Marcus Voss and my mother, Renata, who died of a pulmonary embolism when I was 7. My father built a mid-sized commercial real estate management firm called Voss Capital Partners. Over 30 years. At its peak, the firm managed a portfolio worth approximately $42 million in assets under management, spread across 14 commercial properties in the Bay Area and Central Valley. I know those numbers precisely because I worked there for 6 years, because I have the filings, and because my father spent 11 of the last 12 years systematically removing me from the succession structure. He had promised me since I was old enough to understand what a succession structure was. He did it quietly. That is the part I want you to understand. Before anything else. He did not yell. He did not disinherit me in a rage. He did it the way you reroute water, a little at a time. So the ground downstream dries out slowly, and by the time you notice, the source has been redirected for years. He had a system. He had paperwork. He had a lawyer named Gerald Fitch, whose office on Montgomery Street I drove past for 6 years without knowing what was being signed inside it. And he had a second wife named Pamela, who understood the system completely and never once raised her voice either. Stay with me. This is where it starts. My father married Pamela Ostrander in the spring of the year. I turned 19. I was finishing my freshman year at UC Davis. He called me on a Sunday evening and told me they had done it at the courthouse that Friday, just the two of them and 2 witnesses. He said he had not wanted a fuss. I said, "Congratulations," and meant it, or tried to. Pamela had 2 children from her first marriage. Her son, Garrett, was 22. Her daughter, Soren, was 17. I had met them twice at dinners. That felt like auditions. They were polite, in the way people are polite, when they have already been told what they are going to receive. I did not understand that at the time I was 19. I thought I was being welcomed into a larger family. I thought the dinners were just dinners. The first document I did not know existed was filed 8 months after that wedding. It was an amendment to the operating agreement of Voss Capital Partners, dated January 9th of the year I turned 20. The amendment restructured the ownership interest allocation. Before the amendment, my father held 100% of the managing member interest, with a written succession letter on file, naming me as his designated successor. After the amendment, the managing member interest was restructured into 3 tiers. My father retained 60%. A new entity called Ostrander Family Holdings LLC received 25%. The remaining 15% was placed into a discretionary allocation pool to be assigned at the managing member's sole determination. My name did not appear anywhere in the amended document. The succession letter was not revoked. It was simply superseded by the new operating agreement, which took precedence. Gerald Fitch had been very careful about that. The succession letter still existed. It just no longer meant anything. I did not know about this amendment for 4 more years. What I knew in those 4 years was the surface of things. I graduated from UC Davis with a degree in business administration. My father offered me a position at Voss Capital Partners as an asset coordinator, which is a real job with a real salary. I was paid $62,000 a year. I moved back to San Francisco, and I worked hard. And I believed I was building towards something. My father told me at least twice a year, at dinners or on the phone, that the firm would be mine someday. He said it the way people say things they have already quietly arranged not to be true. He said it warmly. He said it with his hand on my shoulder. He said it in front of Pamela, who smiled and nodded and never contradicted him. I wrote the dates of those conversations in the margin of my personal planner, not because I was suspicious, not yet, but because my father had taught me that a number you remember is a guess, and a number you write down is a fact, and I had internalized that lesson more completely than he ever intended. Pamela was not cruel to me. I want to be precise about that, because the truth is more complicated. and more useful than a cartoon. She was warm in a specific, bounded way. She remembered my birthday. She asked about my work. She sent me a handwritten card. When I got a promotion, she was the kind of person who makes you feel seen in small doses and managed in large ones. She had a gift for making the shape of a conversation feel generous, while the content of it moved steadily in one direction. I noticed this, the way you notice a slight grade in a road, not as a hill, just as a persistent lean. I noticed it, and I filed it, and I did not yet know what to do with it. Garrett joined the firm 2 years after I did. He had a degree from a school in Arizona I had never heard of, and no experience in commercial real estate. My father gave him the title of Director of Acquisitions. His salary was $94,000 a year. I know this because I processed payroll for 14 months before that responsibility was quietly reassigned. I did not say anything. I went on. I told myself it was my father's firm and his right to hire whoever he wanted. I told myself Garrett would find his level. What I did not tell myself, because I was not ready to hear it, was that the gap between $62,000 and $94,000 was not a coincidence. It was a signal I was not yet fluent enough to read. Soren joined the firm 3 years after Garrett. She was given the title of Director of Client Relations. Her salary was $88,000. I had been promoted twice by then and was earning $79,000. I processed the paperwork for her onboarding myself. I sat at my desk on the 4th floor of our building on Market Street, and I typed her name into the system, and I entered the number, and I sat very still for a moment. Then I opened my desk drawer, and I took out the small green notebook I kept there, a smaller version of the original ledger, and I wrote the date, the name, and the number. I wrote it without knowing exactly why. Some part of me that had been trained since age 9 understood that this was a number that needed to be written down. That was the day. The record-keeping changed from habit to purpose. If you have ever had the moment where a pattern you have been half seeing suddenly sharpens into focus all at once, you know exactly what I mean. It is not dramatic. It does not arrive with noise. It arrives the way a photograph develops in a dark room. The shape's already there, the light just finally doing its work. I did not cry. I did not confront anyone. I went home to my apartment on Fillmore Street. I made tea. I sat at my kitchen table, and I opened my laptop, and I started pulling every document I had legitimate access to as an employee of the firm. I worked until 2:14 a.m. I printed what I could print. I photographed what I could not. I started a new folder on an external hard drive. I bought the following morning at a store on Van Ness Avenue for $47. I labeled the folder with a single word, ledger. That detail matters later. Here is what I found in the first 2 weeks of looking. And I want to give you the numbers exactly, because the numbers are the story. The January 9th amendment I mentioned, the one I did not know about, was the first in a series of 7 amendments to the operating agreement, filed over 11 years. I found references to them in the firm's annual compliance summaries, which I had access to as part of my administrative role. The amendments themselves were not in the firm's internal document system. They had been filed directly with the California Secretary of State and with the firm's registered agent, Gerald Fitch's office. I had to request copies through the state's public records portal. They arrived as a PDF attachment to an email at 7:43 am on a Tuesday, and I sat in my car in the parking garage on Market Street, and I read all 7 of them before I went upstairs. The progression was methodical. The January 9th Amendment had moved 25% of the managing member interest to Ostrander Family Holdings. A second amendment, filed 31 months later, moved an additional 10% of the discretionary pool to a new entity called G. Voss Management, LLC. G. Voss. Garrett. Voss. My father had given Garrett his own management entity. A third amendment, filed 22 months after that, did the same for Soren, creating S. Voss Consulting, LLC. By the time I read the 7th and most recent amendment, filed 14 months before the conference table meeting I described at the start of this story, the ownership structure of Voss Capital Partners looked like this. My father retained 40% of the managing member interest. Ostrander Family Holdings held 25%. Voss Management held 17%. Voss Consulting held 14%. The discretionary allocation pool, the one that had originally held 15%, had been reduced to 4%. My name appeared nowhere in any of these documents, not as a beneficiary, not as a designated successor, not as a holder of any interest at all. 11 years, 7 amendments, 0 conversations. I want to pause here because I know what some of you are thinking. You are thinking, why didn't she just ask him? And I want to answer that honestly, I did ask him. Not about the amendments, because I did not know about those yet, but I asked him about the succession plan. 3 times over 6 years. The first time, at a dinner on his back deck in Marin when I was 24, he said, "Delia, you are the future of this firm," and he said it with such complete and practiced warmth that I believed him and felt guilty for having asked. The second time, at a lunch near the office when I was 27, he said the plan was being formalized and that Gerald was handling the paperwork. I wrote that in my planner. Gerald is handling the paperwork. The third time, at a Sunday dinner at the house in Marin. When I was 29, I asked more directly. I said, "Dad, I need to understand what my role in the succession looks like on paper." He looked at me across the table with an expression I can only describe as gentle disappointment. The expression of a man who feels that a reasonable request is somehow an act of ingratitude. He said, "Delia, I have always taken care of you." He said it like that was an answer. Pamela passed the bread. Garrett refilled his water glass. Soren looked at her phone. The conversation moved on. I wrote it in my planner. He said, "He has always taken care of me. No specifics given." That was the last time I asked. I need to tell you about the person who helped me understand what I was looking at, because she is the reason I did not make a single mistake in the 14 months between finding the amendments and sitting down at that conference table. Her name is Constance Arriaga. She is 63 years old, and she is a forensic accountant who works out of a small office on Sacramento Street in San Francisco, 2 blocks from a bakery I used to go to on Saturday mornings as a kid. I found her through a referral from a colleague who had used her in a business dispute. I called her on a Wednesday afternoon in October, and I described my situation in general terms, and she said, "Bring me everything you have, and we will see what the numbers say." I drove to her office the following Saturday with a box of printed documents and an external hard drive. She made coffee. She put on reading glasses. She opened the first folder, and she did not say anything for a long time. Then she looked up at me over the glasses, and she said the line I will carry for the rest of my life. She said, "Delia, someone worked very hard to make sure you would never find this. That means someone knew it was worth finding." I have thought about that sentence every day since she said it, not because it made me feel powerful, because it made me feel, for the first time in 11 years, that I had not been imagining things, that the lean in the road was real, that the grade was real, that the water had been rerouted. And I was not crazy for noticing the dry ground. Constance spent 4 months going through everything. She is not a dramatic person. She does not use words like fraud or theft until she has the arithmetic to back them up. And she will not back them up until she has checked the arithmetic 3 times. She charged me $220 an hour, and I paid every invoice within 30 days, which I know because I logged every payment in the ledger folder on my hard drive. Total fees over 4 months, $18,480. I had that money because I had been saving aggressively since I was 22. Partly because my father had taught me to, and partly because some quiet animal part of me had always understood that I might need it. What Constance found, stated plainly, was this. Over 11 years, through the 7 amendments and through a series of internal management fee structures, she reconstructed from the firm's tax filings. My father had transferred economic interests worth approximately $2,300,000 away from the succession structure he had promised me and into entities controlled by Pamela, Garrett, and Soren. She documented this in a 41-page report with footnotes, source citations, and a summary table on page 3 that laid out every transfer in chronological order with the corresponding document reference. She titled the report Voss Capital Partners, Structural Analysis of Ownership Interest, Transfers, October through February. She printed 2 copies, bound them in plain gray covers, and handed me one across her desk. On a Saturday morning in late February, she said, "This is what the numbers say. What you do with it is your decision." I drove home with the report on the passenger seat. I did not open it again that day. I made dinner. I watched something on television that I cannot remember. I took Constance's copy to a FedEx store on Divisadero Street the following Monday morning, and I mailed it to the California Department of Business Oversight with a cover letter I had written and rewritten 7 times. I kept my copy in the storage unit in Sacramento, in a fireproof box I had bought for $63, along with the hard drive, the printed amendments, and the original green ledger from Cabrillo Street, which I had retrieved from my father's house during a visit 2 years earlier. Telling him I wanted it for sentimental reasons, he had waved his hand and said, "Of course, take it." He did not know what was in it. He had forgotten that the first entry was dated, that the columns reconciled, that I had been keeping records since I was 9 years old. Now, the conference table. I need to back up by 3 weeks to explain how I ended up in that room, because the meeting was not my idea. My father called me on a Tuesday evening in the 2nd week of March. He said he wanted to sit down with me and Gerald and discuss the firm's future direction. He said it was time to formalize some things. He used that word, formalize, the same word he had used at the lunch, when I was 27. And I felt the old reflex, the hope. The pull of wanting to believe that this time the word meant what it sounded like. I recognized the reflex. And I set it aside. I said, I would be there. I wrote the date in my planner. I did not tell him about the report I had mailed. I did not tell him about Constance. I did not tell him about the storage unit, or the fireproof box, or the 41 pages of footnoted arithmetic. I said I would be there, and I drove to Sacramento that night, and I took the gray-bound report out of the fireproof box, and I put it in a canvas bag in the trunk of my car, and I drove back to San Francisco, and I went to sleep. The meeting was at 10 a.m. on a Thursday, at Gerald Fitch's office on Montgomery Street. I arrived at 9:52. The receptionist offered me water. I said, no, thank you. I sat in a chair near the window, and I looked at the bay, and I thought about the green ledger and the red margin line, and my father's block print handwriting at the top of the first page. I thought about the Sunday dinners, and the reconciled columns, and the lesson I had learned so well that I had eventually turned it on the teacher. My father arrived at 10:03 with Pamela. Garrett and Soren were already in the conference room. Gerald Fitch came in last, carrying a folder. He is a compact man in his late 50s, with a careful handshake and the kind of unhurried manner that signals long practice at delivering unwelcome information in comfortable rooms. He set the folder on the table. He said he was glad everyone could be here. He said they had some documents to review. The document was a restructuring agreement. It formalized, that word again, the current ownership allocations of Voss Capital Partners, and established a transition plan for my father's eventual retirement from the managing member role. Under the transition plan, the managing member responsibilities would pass to a 3-person management committee consisting of Garrett, Soren, and a to-be-named outside professional. My name was not in the document, not as a committee member, not as a successor, not as a holder of any interest. There was a section titled Acknowledgement of Prior Commitments, and it contained a single sentence. Any prior informal understandings regarding succession are hereby superseded by this agreement. Any prior informal understandings. 11 years of dinners. 3 direct conversations. His hand on my shoulder. You are the future of this firm. Any prior informal understandings. Gerald slid a copy across the table to me. My father looked at me with a gentle disappointment expression. Preloaded, already in place before I had said a single word. Pamela had her hands folded on the table. Garrett was looking at his phone under the table edge. Soren was looking at the window. I picked up the document. I read it. I set it down. I looked at my father. I said, I have a question about the January 9th amendment. The room changed. Temperature. Gerald's pen stopped moving. My father's expression shifted, not to guilt, not yet, but to the particular stillness of a man who has just heard a word he did not expect in a room he thought he controlled. Pamela's hands, still folded, tightened slightly. I watched her knuckles. I said specifically, I have a question about the progression from the January 9th Amendment through the 7th Amendment, filed 14 months ago, and the corresponding management fee structures documented in the firm's tax filings for the same period. Gerald said, Those are internal operational documents, I said. They are filed with the California Secretary of State and with your office as registered agent. So they are public record. I requested copies through the state portal. I have them. My father said my name, just my name, Delia. The way you say a name when you are trying to decide what register to use next, I said. I am not here to argue. I am here because you asked me to come and review documents. And I have reviewed documents. I have reviewed quite a few of them. I have also had them reviewed by a forensic accountant. And her findings were submitted to the California Department of Business Oversight at 8 a.m. this morning. Garrett looked up from his phone. I said, I want to be clear about what I am asking for and what I am not asking for. I am not asking for an apology. I am not asking for a scene. I am asking for a conversation about the 41-page analysis of ownership interest. Transfers totaling approximately $2,300,000 over 11 years. And what the appropriate remedy looks like. I would like to have that conversation with counsel present, which is why I brought my own. I had not mentioned my attorney until that moment. Her name is Patricia Shen, and she was sitting in the lobby downstairs, which I had arranged the previous week. I sent her a text with one word. Now, 40 seconds later, she walked through the conference room door with her own folder and sat down beside me. Gerald looked at my father. My father looked at the table. Pamela looked at the window. Soren had gone very still. Garrett put his phone face down on the table. I want to be precise about what I felt in that moment, because I think people expect a story like this to have a moment of triumph, a surge, a release. What I felt was closer to the feeling at the end of a very long calculation, when the columns finally reconcile. Not joy, not victory, completion. The columns balanced. The record was accurate. The number I had written down was a fact. My father signed the restructuring agreement that morning. He signed it because Gerald advised him to, because Patricia had already outlined the exposure in a letter she had sent to Gerald's office the previous Friday, and because the 41 pages of footnoted arithmetic were not going away. He signed it, and he looked at me while he signed it, and I looked back at him, and I did not look away, and I did not look satisfied, and I did not cry. I had done my crying already, alone, in my car in the parking garage on Market Street. On the morning I read the 7 amendments in the PDF. I had sat in that car for 22 minutes, and I had cried the way you cry when something you hoped was not true turns out to have been true for 11 years. Then I had wiped my face and gone upstairs and done my job. That was the only time. I had promised myself it would be the only time, and it was. The settlement took 4 months to negotiate. Patricia handled most of it. The final terms are confidential, which means I cannot give you the exact number, but I can tell you that Constance's 41-page analysis was the foundation of every conversation, and that the outcome reconciled with the arithmetic she had laid out on page 3 of the Graybound report. I can also tell you that I no longer work at Voss Capital Partners. I resigned the week after the conference table meeting, effective 30 days later, and I spent those 30 days transferring my files, completing my outstanding projects, and saying goodbye to the colleagues I had worked alongside for 6 years. I did it without drama. I did it the way you close a door. You have decided not to slam. I want to tell you about the weeks between the conference table and the settlement, because that is where the story actually lives, not in the confrontation, But in the aftermath, which is always quieter and stranger than anyone expects, my father called me 4 times in the first 2 weeks. I did not answer. Not out of spite. I had nothing to say into a phone. If he wanted to find me, he knew where the work of finding me started. And the work started with the 41 pages, not with a phone call. He did not leave voicemails. He called, and the phone vibrated against the wooden table in my apartment on Fillmore Street. And I watched it, and I let it go still. Pamela called. Once. She left a voicemail. I listened to it once and deleted it. She said she hoped we could find a way through this as a family. She said the word family 3 times in 90 seconds. I noticed the way the word was being used as a container for something it could not actually hold. Garrett did not call. Soren sent a text that said, "I am sorry you feel this way." I read it and put my phone down and made dinner. The person who actually showed up was Constance. She called me on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after the conference table, and asked if I wanted to get coffee. We met at the bakery on Sacramento Street, 2 blocks from her office, the one near where I used to go on Saturday mornings as a kid. She ordered a plain coffee and a roll. I ordered the same. We sat at a table by the window, and she asked how I was doing. Not in the way people ask when they want a short answer, but in the way she does everything, carefully, with room for the real answer. I told her I was tired in a way that sleep was not fixing. She nodded. She said that was the right kind of tired. She said it meant the work was done. She asked me what I was going to do next. I told her I was thinking about going back to school for a graduate degree in accounting. She looked at me over her coffee cup, and she smiled, which she does rarely enough that it registers. She said, "I thought you might say that. I have thought about why I told her that before I had told anyone else, before I had fully decided it myself. I think it is because she was the first person in 11 years who had looked at the record I had been keeping and told me it was real, not imagined. Not sentimental. Not informal. Real and documented and worth something. That detail matters too. Here is what happened with my father, because I know you are waiting for it. And I want to be honest about what it was and was not. He came to my apartment on a Sunday afternoon in the 5th week after the conference table. He did not call first. He rang the bell at 2:47 p.m. And I looked at the intercom screen, and I stood there for a moment, and then I pressed the button and said, "Come up." He came up the stairs, slowly. He is 64 years old, and the stairs in my building are steep. And he looked tired in the way people look when they have been carrying something they cannot put down. I opened a door. He was standing in the hallway in a jacket that was a size too large, the way his jackets always are now, and he was holding the green ledger. He had gone back to the house on Cabrillo Street, which he still owns and rents out, and he had found it in the closet of my old room, which I had not cleaned out completely when I left for college. He had apparently been looking for it since the conference table meeting. He held it out to me, and I took it and I looked at it, and then I looked at him. He said, "I taught you that." I said, "Yes, you did." He said, "I did not think you would use it this way." I said, "You taught me that a number you write down is a fact." I wrote down a lot of numbers. He stood in my hallway for a moment. He is not a man who apologizes easily. He is a man who built a firm over 30 years and made decisions he believed were practical, and told himself a story about those decisions that let him sleep. I could see him trying to find the version of the story that still held. I watched him not find it. He said, "I thought I was protecting the firm." I said, "From me." He did not answer that. He looked at the ledger in my hands. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "Your mother would have kept records too." I did not expect that. I had not thought about my mother in the context of this story, or I had not let myself, and the sentence landed somewhere undefended. I held very still. I said, "I know." He said. He was sorry. He said it once plainly, without the warmth he uses when he wants a word to do extra work. He said it the way you say a thing when you have finally run out of the other ways to say it. I believed him. I believed he was sorry. I also believed that sorry was the beginning of a very long road, and not the end of one. And I told him so. I said, "I believe you," I said. "That is not the same as us being fine," I said. "I do not know what we are yet." I said, "Come back in 6 months, and we will see what there is to say." He nodded. He went back down the stairs. I closed the door, and I stood in my apartment with the green ledger, and I did not cry. I had already done that. I sat down at my kitchen table, and I opened the ledger to the first page, and I read the first entry in my enormous uneven, 9-year-old handwriting. October 14th. Allowance. Received $5. Balance $5. I turned to the last page my father had written on, the one where he had demonstrated the reconciliation for me the first time. His block print was neat and exact. He had written, total in, total out, balance, balance. He had drawn a line under the balance and written the word, confirmed. I sat with that for a while. Then I opened the ledger to a fresh page near the back. The first blank page after 22 years of entries. I wrote the date at the top in my own handwriting, which is nothing like his anymore. I wrote, settlement received. I wrote the amount, which I will not share here, but which reconciled exactly with Constance's arithmetic. On page 3 of the gray-bound report, I wrote, balance for, I drew the line. I wrote the word, confirmed. I closed the ledger. I put it on the shelf above my desk where I can see it from my kitchen table. It is the same green cloth cover, soft at the corners. The red margin line is still printed down the left side of every page. It looks like the same object it has always been. It is not. It started as a lesson my father gave me about the value of keeping records. It became the record that documented what he had done. And now, it is the first page of whatever comes next, which is mine to write, and mine alone. That is the thing. About a ledger, it does not care who taught you to use it. It only cares whether the columns reconcile. I am going back to school in the fall. I have a small apartment on Fillmore Street, and a shelf of green ledgers and a forensic accountant who meets me for coffee on Saturday mornings. and asks the real question and waits for the real answer. I do not have my father's firm. I do not have the succession he promised me across 11 years of dinners. I do not have the version of the story where the family comes back together and everyone learns, and the ring gets passed, and the road gets driven, and the door gets held open. That story was not available to me. What was available was the truth, documented, footnoted, and confirmed. What was available was the record. But I want to go back because I have been moving too fast through the middle years, and the middle years are where the real damage was done. And you deserve to understand it fully before I tell you how it ended. The conference table was the last chapter. The middle years were the whole book, and the middle years had a texture to them that I have not yet described. A specific quality of being managed that is very hard to name unless you have lived inside it. Here is what being managed by my father and Pamela actually felt like from the inside. It felt like being included. That is the part that makes it so hard to see while it is happening. I was not excluded from family dinners. I was invited to every one of them. The Sunday meals at the house in Marin, the holiday gatherings, the birthday celebrations. I sat at the table. I was handed food and asked about my week. Pamela remembered the name of a difficult client I had mentioned 3 months earlier and asked how that situation had resolved. My father poured my wine before he poured anyone else's. Kay, these are not the behaviors of people who are erasing you. These are the behaviors of people who are very good at making erasure feel like belonging. The inclusion was real in every dimension that could be seen, and false in every dimension that could only be read. I was at the table. My name was not in the documents. I was asked about my week. My interest in the firm was being quietly redistributed. I was handed wine. The succession letter was being superseded by amendments I did not know existed. If you have ever been managed this way, you know the particular exhaustion of it. It is not the exhaustion of being attacked. It is the exhaustion of trying to reconcile two versions of the same reality. The one you can see and the one you can feel, and being told, by the warmth of every surface interaction, that the version you can feel is wrong. I started keeping a second kind of record in the 3rd year. I worked at the firm, not financial records, a different kind. I started writing down conversations, not all of them, just the ones where something was said that I wanted to remember exactly. I used a plain spiral notebook, the kind you buy in a drugstore, and I kept it in the drawer of my nightstand at home, not at the office. I wrote in it the same night the conversation happened, while the words were still exact. I wrote the date, the location, who was present, and what was said, as close to verbatim as I could manage. I did this because my father had taught me that a number you remember is a guess, and a number you write down is a fact. And I had begun to understand that the same principle applied to words. By the end of 6 years, I had filled 3 of those spiral notebooks. I have them still. They are in the fireproof box in Sacramento, along with everything else. I have never shown them to anyone, not even Constance, not even Patricia. They were not evidence in the legal sense. They were evidence in the personal sense. They were the record of what I had actually heard, as opposed to what I would later be told I had misunderstood. The Sunday dinners in Marin deserve their own accounting, because they were the primary theater of the management. And I want you to understand how a theater works before I tell you the specific performance that finally broke something open in me. The house in Marin is a large craftsman on a hillside with a view of the bay from the back deck. My father bought it the year I started high school. After a particularly good run of acquisitions, my mother never lived there. She died when I was 7 in the house on Cabrillo Street. And the Marin house always felt to me like a place that had been built after she was gone. A place where her absence was not a wound, but simply an architectural fact. Pamela had decorated it. She had good taste. And she had exercised it thoroughly. Every room was comfortable and considered, and faintly impersonal in the way of rooms that have been professionally arranged. There were no photographs of my mother anywhere in the house. There were photographs of me, 2 of them, both from childhood, both in a hallway near the guest bathroom, where they could be seen but not dwelt upon. I noticed the placement of those photographs the first time I visited after the wedding. I noticed it, and I said nothing, and I filed it under the category of things I was not yet ready to name. The Sunday dinners followed a reliable structure. Arrival between 4 p.m. and 4:30 p.m. Drinks on the deck, if the weather permitted, which in Marin it usually did. Dinner at 6 p.m., always at the large table in the dining room. Never the smaller table in the kitchen. My father at one end, Pamela at the other, Garrett and Soren on one side, me on the other, usually alone, unless I had brought someone, which after the 3rd year, I rarely did, because bringing someone to those dinners required explaining them afterward, in ways I found increasingly difficult. The conversation at dinner was managed the way the room was managed, comfortably, with good taste, and with a consistent gravitational pull toward Garrett's projects and Soren's relationships and the firm's recent wins, which were always framed as collective achievements in a way that made individual contribution invisible. I want to give you a specific example because specificity is the only thing that makes this real. In the fall of the year I was 28, I closed the largest lease renewal in the firm's history for a commercial tenant in a building on Howard Street. The tenant had been threatening to relocate for 18 months. I had spent 4 months in negotiations, working with their facilities team and their legal counsel, restructuring the lease terms in a way that addressed their operational concerns, while protecting the firm's revenue position. The final agreement locked in a 7-year renewal at a rate that was 11% above the market average for comparable space. My father called me the morning after the signing and said, "Dila, that was exceptional work." He said it with genuine warmth. I believed him. That Sunday, at dinner, the Howard Street renewal came up in conversation. My father mentioned it to the table. He said the firm had just completed a significant lease renewal on Howard Street, a real win for the portfolio. Garrett asked about the terms. My father gave a summary. Soren said that was great. Pamela said she was glad things were going well at the firm. Nobody said my name. Nobody said who had done the work. The renewal existed. I did not. In the telling of it, I sat across the table, and I ate my dinner, and I did not say anything. I was 28. I was still in the phase where I told myself these things were oversights, not patterns. I was still in the phase where I believed that the warmth of the private phone call meant more than the silence of the public table. I was wrong about that. The private phone call was the management. The public table was the truth. I wrote it in the spiral notebook that night. Date. Location. Location. What was said? What was not said? Who was present? I drew a line under it, the way my father had taught me. To draw a line under a reconciled column. I did not write a conclusion. I just wrote the facts and let them sit. That is the discipline that took the longest to learn, not the record keeping, the waiting, the willingness to write the fact down and not yet decide what it meant, to let the pattern accumulate without forcing it into a shape before it was ready. I am a person who wants to understand things quickly. I am a person who finds uncertainty uncomfortable in the specific way that people find it uncomfortable when they have been trained since childhood to reconcile columns before dinner. The waiting was the hardest part of the whole 11 years. Harder than the conference table. Harder than the parking garage. Harder than reading 7 amendments in a PDF at 7:43 a.m. and understanding what they meant. The waiting required me to hold 2 things at once for a very long time. The surface, which said I was included and valued and the future of the firm, and the record, which said something else entirely. Holding both without resolving them prematurely is the thing I am most proud of in this whole story. Not the confrontation. Not the 41 pages. The waiting. The discipline of the open column. Stay with me. This is where the pattern finally became undeniable. In the spring of the year, I was 29. My father announced at a Sunday dinner that he was restructuring the firm's senior leadership team. He said it casually, between the salad and the main course. The way you mention a change in travel plans. He said Garrett would be taking on an expanded role as Chief Operating Officer. He said Soren would be moving into a newly created position as Director of Strategic Partnerships. He said both transitions would be effective the first of the following month. He said he was excited about the direction the firm was heading. He did not mention my role. He did not say my title was changing. He did not say my responsibilities were expanding or contracting or staying the same. He said nothing about me at all. He moved from Soren's new title directly to asking Pamela whether she had heard back from the contractor about the deck railing. I sat at the table for the rest of that dinner. I ate the main course. I had a second glass of wine. I helped clear the plates. I said goodbye at 8:15 p.m. and drove back across the bridge to San Francisco. And I parked my car on Fillmore Street, and I sat in it for a while in the dark, not crying, just sitting. Trying to locate the exact shape of what had just happened. Here is what I understood. Sitting in that car, I had been at the firm for 5 years. I had closed the largest lease renewal in its history. I had managed the asset coordination for 3 major acquisitions. I had been promoted twice. I had sat at that table for 5 years of Sunday dinners, and I had been present for every conversation about the firm's direction. And I had never once been included in the planning of it. I had been informed. There is a difference between being included in a plan and being informed of one after it is made. I had been informed consistently, warmly, with good wine for 5 years. I went upstairs to my apartment. I took out the spiral notebook. I wrote the date and the location and what had been said. Then, For the first time in 5 years of keeping that notebook, I wrote a conclusion. I wrote, "This is not an oversight. This is the structure." I drew a line under it. I did not write the word confirmed. I was not ready for that yet. But I drew the line. The following Monday morning, I arrived at the office at 8:45 a.m. and I requested a meeting with my father. His assistant, a careful woman named Diane, who had worked for the firm for 12 years, and who I believe understood more about its internal dynamics than she ever said aloud, told me he was available Thursday at 2 p.m. I said, "That worked." I went to my desk. I opened my laptop. I started pulling the annual compliance summaries. I want to tell you about Diane, because she is part of this story in a way that is easy to overlook. Diane Kowalski had been my father's executive assistant since before I joined the firm. She was 57 years old, precise and unhurried, with the particular competence of someone who has spent decades being the most organized person in any room she enters. She knew where every document was. She knew every deadline, every filing, every meeting my father had taken for 12 years. She was not my ally in any active sense. She never told me anything she was not supposed to tell me, but she had a way of answering questions that was technically complete and contextually generous. And over 6 years, I had learned to pay attention to the texture of her answers, as much as their content. When I asked her, in the week after the Sunday dinner announcement, whether the firm had filed any amendments to its operating agreement in the past year, she said she would need to check with Gerald's office on that, as those filings went through outside counsel. She said it without inflection. She said it looking at her computer screen. She did not say yes or no. She said she would need to check with Gerald's office. I wrote that in the spiral notebook that night, not the words. The texture, the specific quality of an answer that is technically accurate and deliberately incomplete. I did not ask her again. I went to the state portal instead. The Thursday meeting with my father was at 2 p.m. in his office, on the top floor of the building on Market Street. His office has a view of the bay on clear days. It was a clear day. He was warm. He offered me coffee. He asked how I was doing. I said I was doing well. I said I wanted to talk about the leadership restructuring he had announced at dinner. He said, of course, he had been meaning to follow up with me about that. He said my role was evolving too, that he had been thinking about creating a new position for me focused on portfolio optimization, a role that would leverage my analytical strengths. He said he was still working out the details with Gerald. Gerald is handling the details. I wrote it in my planner. That afternoon, same words as 2 years earlier, same construction, same referral to the same lawyer. I sat at my desk after the meeting, and I looked at those words, and I understood that I had been hearing a version of this sentence for 6 years, and that the details Gerald was handling had never once been shared with me, and that this was not an accident. I went home that evening, and I opened my laptop, and I submitted a records request to the California Secretary of State for all filings associated with Voss Capital Partners over the preceding 12 years. The request cost $22, payable by credit card. I paid it. Paid. I wrote it in the ledger folder on my hard drive. $22. Records Request. California, Secretary of State. Date. The records arrived. 6 weeks later. 7 amendments. I read them in the parking garage at 7:43 a.m. I sat in that car for 22 minutes. Then I wiped my face and went upstairs and did my job. I want to tell you something about those 22 minutes because I think they matter, and I have not described them fully. I did not cry because I was surprised. I cried because I was not. I had been half-knowing for years. I had been writing things in notebooks and folders and planners for years. I had been drawing lines under facts and waiting for the pattern to complete itself for years. And when it finally completed itself, when the 7 amendments were on my phone screen in the parking garage, and the arithmetic was undeniable, what I felt was not shock. It was the specific grief of a thing you hoped was not true, turning out to have been true all along. And the grief was not for the money, or the firm, or the succession. The grief was for the dinners, for the hand on the shoulder, for the warmth that had been real enough to feel and false enough to function as cover for 11 years of systematic removal. The grief was for the 9-year-old at the kitchen table on Cabrillo Street, who had been handed a green ledger by a man she trusted completely, and told that a number you write down is a fact. That girl had believed him. She had believed him so completely that she had spent 22 years writing things down. She had just not known, until that morning in the parking garage, that she had been writing down the evidence of his own betrayal. I cried for her, for the 9-year-old. Then I wiped my face, and I went upstairs. If you have ever cried in a parking garage for a version of yourself you had to leave behind in order to become the version that could handle what came next, drop a comment. I will read. Everyone. The 14 months between the parking garage and the conference table were the most disciplined of my life. I want to walk you through them in some detail because the discipline is the point. The discipline is what separated the outcome. I got from the outcome I could have gotten if I had moved too fast, or too emotionally, or without the right help. The first thing I did after the parking garage was call Constance. I have already told you about that call, and about the 4 months she spent going through the documents, but I have not told you about the other work I was doing in parallel. The work that was not financial, but was equally important. I was building a timeline, not for legal purposes, not yet for myself. I needed to understand the full shape of what had happened before I could decide what to do about it. I took the spiral notebooks, all 3 of them, and I transferred every entry into a single document. On my laptop, organized chronologically, I added the financial records Constance was developing. I added the amendments. I added the payroll figures I had logged in the small green notebook from my desk drawer. I added the entries from my personal planner. Every conversation about succession. Every time Gerald's name had been mentioned. Every Sunday dinner where something had been said or not said that I had written down. The document was 47 pages long. When I finished it, I printed it once, read it once, and put it in the fireproof box in Sacramento. I did not need to read it again. I had built it to understand the shape of the thing. And once I understood the shape, I could hold it without the pages. The shape was this: 11 years of parallel tracks. On one track, the surface, inclusion, warmth, succession promises, Sunday dinners, hands on shoulders, wine poured first. On the other track, the record. 7 amendments, 2 management entities created for Garrett and Soren, management fee structures that redirected economic value, a succession letter superseded by documents I was never shown. The 2 tracks ran side by side for 11 years and never intersected. That was not an accident. That was architecture. I want to say something about Gerald Fitch, because he has been a figure in this story without being a character in it. And I think he deserves a moment of precision. Gerald Fitch is a competent attorney. He is not a villain in the cartoon sense. He did not invent the scheme. He executed it carefully and over many years in a way that was technically legal at each individual step, while being systematically harmful in its aggregate effect. He filed the amendments correctly. He structured the entities correctly. He drafted the supersession language in the restructuring agreement with particular care of a man who understands that the most durable harm is the kind that cannot be easily named. He is the kind of professional who makes a system work by never asking whether the system should. I do not hate Gerald Fitch. I find him more useful as a lesson than as an enemy. The lesson is that harm does not require malice. It requires only competence and service of the wrong instruction. Patricia Shen, my attorney, is the opposite of Gerald Fitch in every way that matters. She is 44 years old, and she has spent 20 years doing exactly the kind of work this case required. Untangling the architecture of quiet harm and translating it into language that a settlement negotiation can act on. She read Constance's 41 pages in one sitting and called me the following morning at 8:07 a.m. and said, "This is solid." She said it the way Constance says things, without drama, with the weight of someone who has looked at a lot of numbers and knows which ones matter. She said, "I want to talk about strategy." I said, "I am available whenever you are." She said, "Saturday morning." I said, "I will be there." We met at her office on a Saturday morning in early March. She had printed Constance's report and annotated it in red pen. She had also pulled the public filings independently and cross-referenced them against Constance's analysis. She said, "The cross-reference confirmed everything." She said, "The exposure for my father and the firm was significant." She said the question was not whether there was a case, but what outcome I actually wanted. I had thought about this. I had thought about it in the parking garage and in the weeks of building the timeline and in the evenings, when my father's calls vibrated against the wooden table and I watched them go still. I knew what I did not want. I did not want a public proceeding. I did not want a courtroom. I did not want the story to become a story that other people told about my family, in the way that stories like that get told, stripped of texture and nuance, and turned into something that serves a telling more than the truth. I did not want to destroy my father. I wanted the record corrected. I wanted the arithmetic acknowledged. I wanted the columns to reconcile. I told Patricia this. She nodded. She said, "Then we go in with the report and we make clear what the alternative looks like, and we let him decide." She said, "The report does the work. You just have to be in the room." I said, "I can be in the room." She said, "I know you can. That is the second line I will carry for the rest of my life. Not as dramatic as Constance's, but true. In a different way." Constance told me the record was real. Patricia told me I was capable of using it. Both things were necessary. You need someone to confirm the truth and someone to confirm that you are strong enough to carry it into the room where it needs to go. The letter to the California Department of Business Oversight was Patricia's idea, she said, filing it the morning of the conference table. Meeting served two purposes. It created a time-stamped record of disclosure that preceded any agreement signed that day, which mattered for legal reasons I will not try to summarize here. And it meant that when I told my father in that conference room that the findings had been submitted at 8 a.m. that morning, I was telling the truth in a way that could be verified, which meant the statement had a different weight than a threat would have had. A threat is a guess. A documented filing is a fact. My father had taught me that. I was still using the lesson. I mailed the letter on a Wednesday evening. 2 days before the Thursday meeting, I drove to the post office on Haight Street at 5:43 p.m., and I stood at the counter, and I handed the envelope to the clerk, and I watched her put it in the outgoing mail bin. I drove home. I made dinner. I went to sleep at 10:15 p.m., and I slept without difficulty, which surprised me. I had expected to lie awake. I did not. I think the sleeping was easy because the decision had already been made, and made correctly. And the only thing left was to show up on Thursday and be in the room. I was in the room. I have already told you what happened there, but I want to add one thing I have not yet said, because it is the detail that stays with me most. When my father signed the restructuring agreement, the one that formalized the ownership structure that had been built without me, he used a pen from a cup on Gerald's conference table. It was a plain black pen, the kind that comes in a box of 12. He signed his name in the same neat block print he had used at the top of the first page of the Green Ledger 22 years earlier. I watched his hand move. I watched the letters form. I thought about the kitchen table on Cabrillo Street. I thought about the red margin line. I thought about a 9-year old girl being told that a number you write down is a fact. I thought about everything she had written down since then, and what it had added up to, and what it had cost, and what it had finally, after 22 years, confirmed. He set the pen down. He looked at me. I looked back at him. Neither of us said anything. Gerald gathered the papers. Patricia made a note in her folder. Pamela looked at the window. Garrett looked at the table. Soren looked at her hands. I picked up my bag. I stood up. I said, "Thank you for your time." I said it to the room, not to any one person. Then I walked out. The elevator in Gerald's building is slow. I stood in it alone for the 12 floors down to the lobby, and I looked at my reflection in the polished metal doors and I thought, the columns reconcile. That was all. The columns reconcile. It was enough. I have been out of the firm for 4 months now. I am enrolled in a graduate program in accounting that starts in September. I have a small apartment on Fillmore Street with a kitchen table where I sit in the mornings and a shelf above my desk where the Green Ledger lives. I have a forensic accountant who meets me for coffee on Saturday mornings. I have an attorney who answered the phone on a Saturday and said, "I know you can." I have 3 spiral notebooks in a fireproof box in Sacramento that I may never open again because the record they contain has already done its work. I do not have my father's firm. I do not have the Sunday dinners in Marin, though I was not invited to those after the conference table, and I have not asked to be. I do not have the version of the story where the family gathers and the truth is spoken aloud, and everyone understands and the warmth becomes real instead of managed. That story was not available to me. I made my peace with that in the parking garage in 22 minutes before I wiped my face and went upstairs. What I have is the record. What I have is the arithmetic. What I have is the knowledge that for 22 years I wrote things down, and the things I wrote down turned out to be true, and that the truth, documented and footnoted and confirmed, is stronger than 11 years of warmth deployed in service of erasure. My father came to my apartment on a Sunday afternoon, 5 weeks after the conference table. I have already told you most of that visit, but there is one more thing I want to tell you about it. Something I did not include the first time because I was not sure how to say it. After he said he was sorry, after I told him that sorry was the beginning of a long road, and not the end of one, after he went back down the stairs, I stood in my apartment with the green ledger, and I did something I had not planned to do. I opened it to the page where my father had written the first reconciliation demonstration. The one with the neat block print, and the line drawn under the balance, and the word confirmed. I looked at his handwriting. For a long time, I thought about the man who had written it, the man who had sat across from a 9-year. Olden taught her that a number you write down is a fact. And I tried to hold both versions of him at once, the man who gave me the ledger, and the man who spent 11 years hoping I would never use it the way I did. I tried to hold both without resolving them into a simpler story, the way I had learned to hold the surface and the record without forcing them to reconcile. Before they were ready, I could not fully do it. Not yet. Maybe not for a long time, but I could hold the attempt. I could hold the willingness to try. I closed the ledger. I put it on the shelf. I made tea. I sat at my kitchen table in the last of the afternoon light, and I thought about the 9-year. Old on Cabrillo Street, and what she would make of the woman sitting at this table now, with the settlement and the storage unit, and the graduate program starting in September, and the forensic accountant, who meets her for coffee, and the attorney who said, "I know you can." I think she would recognize the handwriting. I think she would check the columns. I think she would draw the line and write the word, confirmed. If you are the person in your family who has been keeping track quietly, who has been writing things down while everyone else was telling you that you were imagining it, I want you to hear this directly. You are not imagining it. The record is real. The columns will reconcile. It may take 4 months or 4 years or 11 years, but the arithmetic does not change because someone is warm while they are doing it. The arithmetic is what it is. Write it down. Keep the notebook. Pay the $22 for the records request. Find the constants in your life. The person who will look at what you have built and tell you it is real and worth finding. Find the Patricia, the person who will look at you across a table and say, "I know you can," and then be in the room. Drop a comment that says, "I kept the ledger." If this story reached you tonight, I will read every single one. If someone in your life is quietly holding a record that no one else believes in, send them this video and tell them you see it. And if you believe that the truth written down is stronger than the truth remembered, subscribe. I will be here next week. The green ledger is on the shelf above my desk. The first entry is in my 9-year old handwriting. The last entry is in mine. My father taught me to draw the line. I drew it. The balance is confirmed.